Hi friends, it's Dare again for 3x Point. Today we'll be learning about SQL constraint. We've seen some in action already from our previous videos when we created primary and foreign key constraint, but we'll be drilling into some more technical detail about constraints in this session. Remember when we talked about our DBMS solution such as SQL Server or Oracle or Sybase or any of these enterprise RDBMS softwares. Remember when we talked about them being able to provide us with database integrity? Yes, they use these constraints to do that. And well, if you don't tell SQL Server or Oracle or any of them how you want this integrity defined, they won't by default provide you with the integrity that you want. So you're going to have to be skilled enough to do that. And that's what I'm going to be showing you in this session. So let's get to work as I bring up my slide. We won't be doing a lot of PowerPoint slides today. We're going into some technical stuff. So, but what do we intend to expect from this session? Well, this session I'll make a series. So if I don't finish all the types of constraints in this session, then the video will have to be split into two, so we don't get too bored in just one video. Right. So what are SQL constraints? These are used to specify rules for the data inside our RDBMS table. Okay. Actions are aborted based on the violation of the rules defined by the constraint. See, this is the problem we have when we see definitions, and I'm very sure you understand what I'm saying. Back in school when they give you definitions like this, you probably don't understand them and you have to cram them, and just find a way to know them by cramming it just to pass your exams. But the understanding will come proper by the time we get into the practical thing. So don't bother about this definition if you don't understand it. By the time we finish our demonstration in our lab, then we'll come back to this definition, and by then you understand it properly. So what are the types of constraints that we have? There are so many of them, but I've listed the main ones that you would ever have to come across from time to time. So we have default, we have check, we have null and not null. There is unique, there's primary key, there's foreign key, there's cascading referential integrity constraint, and there is the identity constraint as well. So we're going to be starting with the default, and yeah, I'll be demonstrating this identity. That's why you have this at identity DBCC check indent. Don't worry about that for now. We'll see all that when we get to the lab. So going into default constraint. What is a default constraint? So now we say it's used to insert or update a record with a defined default value. And SQL Server Engine automatically creates a name for the constraint if none is specified to drop, blah, blah, blah. You know what? Let's just leave all this definition and just go straight into demonstration so that by the time we do that and we come back here, it will make more sense to you. If you already have VMware, you can just bring it up. If you don't have VMware, if what you did on the other hand was to install SQL Server straight on your laptop, then bring SQL Server up straight. And I'm gonna play this virtual machine, but I'm not gonna be using virtual machine for our session today. I just want to remind you that this is how you connect to your instance within the machine. Okay. Alright, so I have my instance set up. Oops, it's signing out. That's because I suspended the machine before. I didn't shut it down. So if you suspend, it won't shut it down. Everything you were working on before will remain like that. So these are the kind of things here. It's just a way of helping you to stay active without deleting or stopping your services. So I'll put my password. Right. So if you have your virtual machines come up like this, you can go into the Windows tab, click on the down arrow and look for SQL Server Management Studio right here, or you can simply just do a search. So I'm going to do something now. Right click on this and pin to taskbar, and I will go back to my desktop, and now I have the icon on the taskbar, so I don't have to go back into all that all the time. So I can just click on this and SQL Server will come up. So, but I'm not going to be working in here today, so that's just for you if that's the environment you have set up. In my own case, I have my Management Studio installed on my local computer, and that's what I'm going to be working with. Right, so we are going to be doing some things. We'll create a database, we'll use the database, we'll create table, and then we will explain what we mean by having default constraint. So first of all, let me drop this. We have the database there already, so let me drop that first. Okay, that's dropped. Okay, the reason why I'm going through the process of creating new database, creating new table all the time is so that you can be reminded all the time the process. Okay, so let's create our database, sample DB. And remember this, we are currently in master. Anything we run right here will go into master. We don't want to do that, so we want to switch into our sample DB, and that's what I've just done. Now let's refresh. We have our sample database. Do we have any table yet? No. So we're going to create a table. So what we mean by default is this. Let me quickly explain to you. So we have our syntax, create table product. Yes. And we have the ID column, and we've specified the data type to be integer, and product name has the varchar data type. That's fine. If you see created date here, you can see the data type I've given to it, which is date time, and then I've specified a command here called default. And what is default going to do? It's going to give me today's date. What get date means is if I want to know today's date, for example, if I said select get date, the open and close parentheses means that it's a function. All right, so if I say select get date and execute, you can see that it's given back today's date, which is 26th 2016 July 23rd. So, and what do we mean by a function? Is a function is just a program that's been created to return something, if that makes sense. So this function is a program that runs behind the scene, right? So what it's been created to do is to return a value, and the value it's returning is today's date. So that's what getDate does. So now I have said getDate is the default for this column. And what that means is anytime I try to insert into this table, if I do not specify a value for create date, the default constraint will kick in, and it will just give me the current date and time at the time that the insert is being committed. So let's try that. So I'll create this table. Okay, that's created. Refresh tables. We have dbo.product, and what are the columns? You can see we have ID, we have product name, we have created date. So if I try to insert into this table, and this is the syntax for insert. So insert into product, I'll specify the the column names, in this case ID, product name, and get date. Now if I say values, I'm giving it value number 1 for ID. For product name, I'm giving it HP, and for created date, I'm just saying put the default value there, and this is what happened. So if I select from the table, you can see that this is what happened. So what this means is, for created date, if I do not want to specify the dates, like for example, if I were to say 2016 07 23, right, this would have been the value that would go into it had it been I knew the date. But in a case where I don't know the dates, I don't want to specify the date, I want the system to automatically put the date for me anytime I run this query, then this is what happens. Okay, so let's have another demonstration. Now in this case, let me put this get date back. Sorry, default. Okay, so that's in a situation where I actually told it, put default, or in a case where I know there's a function behind the scene that's all I need to do is just tell it, you know what, put the default date. Now let's assume that the person who was trying to insert doesn't even know that there's a column called created date, right? It's possible, so let's say the person just know about ID and product name. So we're going to remove the created date. And if he doesn't know that created date exists, obviously he won't know that there's a default for it, right? Because this happens, the created date might have been created by the database administrator or the developer for auditing purposes. But as an end user, for example, like a data analyst who is not aware of the created date, will just specify what they know, which is ID and product name. So for example, now if I insert this record, okay, let me change this to 2, and the value this time may be, let's say, Dell. Now if I insert this record and execute, it still goes. But what happens if I select? You can see that the default still kicks in, and that's what we're talking about here. So to the end user, he knows that he's actually inserted this, but to the sysadmin or the DBA or the developer, they already know that there's another column on the table that could be used for auditing if you want to know when the product was inserted and things like that. So this is pretty much what default does. Now a little more detail is that, you see, this default has a name, okay, and for us to know what the name of the default is, we can do it in 2 ways. We can either graphically go into our table and go into constraints, and as you can see here, we have df product created and all these numbers here. So this is the name of the default that we created. That's to tell you that it is in its own an object. It is, something that has an identity. So it has its own name. And by using SQL, you don't need to worry about all this command, but just for you to know that if you run, there you can query the system tables to be able to get all this metadata out. And in this case, you can see here that it's the same thing, df product created and the same numbers. And creating default doesn't also happen when you create the table like we already did here. You can actually have the table created without default, and later on you want to alter the table and then add the default to it. So let me delete, actually let's just copy this. Yeah, let's just copy this table. We're going to recreate the table. Okay, and before we recreate the table, let's drop the table. Drop table product. Now we're going to recreate the table without the default constraint. And let's refresh this. Okay, so the table is gone now. So now let's recreate the table. And if we refresh, now it's there. If we go into constraints, you can see that we don't have the constraint anymore. Right, so what I actually want to show now is how to create the constraint after the table has been created. So if you write this command, alter table product, and specify the name of the table you want to alter, and you say add constraint, that's the command, and you specify the name of the constraints that you want to add. So the other time we had def underscore product and some numbers, that's because the system generated that itself. But in this case, you're telling it the name you want the table to be, the constraint to be rather. So I have given this, in this case, def created date, which is the name of the column, and it has to be meaningful. So def underscore product to say it is on product table, and created date to also say it is on created date column. And I'll say default. So that's the name of the constraint I want to create. The reason you're doing it this way is because there are several types of constraint that you might want to create. So in this case, we're creating a default constraint. So if you were creating another type of constraint, it's still going to follow the same command by saying auto table, name of the table, and you say add constraint, give the name of the constraint, and then you tell it the type of constraint you want to create. So in this case, what the type of constraint we are creating is default. So we have default here, and then you will tell it what the default will be. And default in this case is going to be get date function. And in addition, you will now say for, and then you specify the name of the column for created date. And that's it. So now, but if you also wanted to create another constraint on the same table on another column, this is how you do it. But for now, I'm just going to remove this and just focus on one constraint for now, just to demonstrate what we're talking about. So that completed, and if we go back into the table, refresh the table, you can see that we have the product default there for the created date. Okay, let's drop the constraints and see. Drop constraint, or let me just let's just do it from graphically here to make it faster. Delete. And yeah, another thing I would like to show you again is anything you want to do graphically, right? Let's go back. If I right click and say delete, remember that whatever you do graphically can be done by query. You see this arrow right here. If you want to see the script that will be running behind the scene, you could just, instead of click on this arrow, just click on script and minimize this, and it will, show you the query that's been run behind. And the query that's going to be run is alter table, name of the table, drop constraint, and the name of the constraint, which was what I wanted to write before, but to save time, you can easily just do it graphically. But since we already got the query out, we could just do this, and now we have the constraints gotten rid of. So that's gone. So let's assume we want the constraints to be on 2 columns on the table. So once we said add constraints, let me put this here so it makes sense to you. So alter table product add, and then you specify the first constraint, which was what we did before, and you can specify another constraint and say constraint, give it a name. So default on the product and the name of the column, which is on name. So we want to put this constraint on, we don't have name on that. Oh, we do, product name, yes, product name. So let me just give it product's name, yes. So this is the name of the column, and I would say I want default constraint, and I want it to default to Lenovo. So meaning if someone is putting the name in certain data into the table, but they don't specify a name for the product, by default, just put Lenovo. That's what this means. So, and then say for product name. So if I run this now and execute and refresh our constraint again, I would see both constraints there. Okay, so let's try to do some insert into the table and see what happens. So first of all, let's see what's on the table. So there's nothing on the table. Okay, so if I did insert into, let me just remove both of them. If I did insert into this, I would have to remove this, because remember, if you're doing insert, if you specify the column names, the number of columns that you specify has to match the number of values that you specify. So in this case, I've only specified for ID, so I'm gonna have to remove all those. And if I say insert into product and the ID, and what happens, you can see that Lenovo kicks in and default kicks in. But what happens if I actually specified the values? Let's say in this case I specify 2016. Actually, to make it faster, I'll just copy this and paste. Okay, so let me change this to 2, and now let's try to insert into this, because now we're not using our default anymore, we're giving them their values. Actually, let me add some more columns and say 3, and this time, because now the constraint I'm having now is the fact that I have specified the number of columns. I have to specify the values as well. So in this case, I have to do default and default, and that's it. And if we select, we'll see 2, this is the one we specified, and 3, we said, you know what, put the default value. So that's what default is all about. So let's go back to our definition now and see if it now makes sense. So we're saying this is used to insert or update a record with a defined default value. So SQL Server Engine automatically creates a name for the constraint if none is specified. So we saw that if you don't specify the name, SQL Server creates the name for us. Yeah, and that's let me show you again. That's what happened when you select from the system table. You want to know, you can see in our own case we actually created the name, we specified the name ourselves. But imagine if we didn't specify the name will be created with some numbers at the end, and that's how SQL Server itself tracks the object that it creates itself. To drop a table with default column, you must first drop the constraint. Well, this does not actually apply to SQL Server. It does to some other RDBMS, but for SQL Server it does not apply, so you can ignore that. So in the absence of a default, null values are inserted or updated. So what this means is that if we didn't have default on the table, right, and you don't specify a value for that column, what will be inserted will be null. So let's try that and let's see what we mean by that. So I've opened a blank workspace, so let me copy out the create table statement. I'd already deleted the table, so we don't have any table here. So we're gonna create it without a default this time around. So, and mind you, what we have here, the fact that we did not specify not null, right? By default, what happens is we have null. So what that means is if we don't tell it if we don't tell it to be not null, by default, this is what happens there. Even if we don't write it, like in the case of this one, for example, internally there is null here. That's what it means. So sometimes if you don't write null, it means there is null there. So in this case, I'm just going to write null and null, but it's the default anyway. Right, so we have the table created, and let's get some data inserted. Let's get some data. One. Okay, so there is no default. There's no default, so we can't use default. Actually, let me just use one. And let's see. Oops, so comma here shouldn't be. The reason why there'll be a comma after that is if we intend to still add more values into it. So select everything from products. So we have this. Now let's assume that we now want to insert. This time around, I'm not going to specify the columns. I'll just say insert into this table 2. And if I say, okay, let me specify ID. And if I say insert and select, see, this is what we have. So and that's exactly what this is saying, if in case you didn't understand that. In the absence of a defined default, null values are inserted or updated. So that's what's just happened. So we don't have defaults and you don't specify anything, null values will be updated there. Okay, so now that we understand what default constraints are, we will be moving into the next kind of constraints, and that will continue in the next video. See you then.